A lot of companies have gone back to business as usual. And part of what I would say is because, like they tried these reactive measures that were only about quantifying or making a pithy statement, but not really about impact, not really about creating inclusion and belonging. And so as a result of that, a lot of the efforts have waned. But I think the companies that have continued to prioritize equity and inclusion, one of the benefits is a higher retention across the employee base, for example. And then you have advocates in the organization who really champion the work that you're doing. I think the reality is that when you bring in people of different identities, backgrounds, perspectives, it can have a measurable benefit on what you're able to achieve as an organization.
You're listening to the Black to Business Podcast, an educational podcast providing Black entrepreneurs with the tools and resources to start and grow their businesses. We chat with vetted Black entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and business owners as they provide tips and resources to help take your business to the next level. I'm your host, Monique T. Marshall. Hey there, and welcome back to the Black to Business Podcast. I am so happy to have you back. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I'm your host, Monique T. Marshall. So as you may know, this month is a special one for us because throughout the entire month of June, we are shining a spotlight on Black men who are leading the way in both their communities and the business world. This is a tradition we hold dear and one that we are excited to continue this year. So here's how we're honoring and celebrating Black men who lead. Every week, we will feature extraordinary individuals on our podcast, sharing their stories, insights, and expertise. But that's not all. We have curated a list of 30 inspiring Black men who are making significant contributions in their respective fields. To take our celebration to the next level, we've also partnered with the Spot NYC to bring back our highly anticipated Black Men Who Lead panel discussion. So save the date next weekend, June 17th at 6 o'clock p.m., which is also Father's Day and Juneteenth weekend. Join us at City Point in downtown Brooklyn for an evening of thought-provoking conversations and networking opportunities. But wait, there is more. We've launched a brand new website, blackmenwholead.com, where you can find the complete list of our honorees and RSVP for the event in New York. Be sure to visit the website and secure your spot. And for our listeners who are in Washington, D.C., mark your calendars for September 21st as we will be hosting the same event in your city. Stay tuned for further details. Now let's dive into today's episode. Joining us is a remarkable guest who embodies the spirit of leadership and the power of diversity, equity, and inclusion in business. Please welcome Daniel Oppong, the founder of the Courage Collective and Boundless. Daniel is passionate about creating a better world through better workplaces and brings a strategic, holistic, and human-centered approach to DEI work. During our conversation today, we're exploring the significance of understanding DEI and its impact on Black entrepreneurs. Daniel shares valuable insights and practical strategies for integrating DEI principles into business practices, fostering inclusive environments, and overcoming challenges as an entrepreneur. Get ready to be inspired, so let's jump right in. Daniel, welcome to the Black to Business Podcast. So happy to have you here, so welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. So I always like to let my listeners know who I'm speaking with. So if you could just share a little bit about who you are, what is it that you do in your business, and kind of how you got where you are today.
For sure. So my name is Daniel Oppong. I'm the founder of the Courage Collective. We are a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy. I took a pretty untraditional path to this space. I got my professional start working in the nonprofit sector. And then from there, I went and got a master's in organizational leadership at Gonzaga University, and then moved to Nashville to work in venture capital, which is really interesting because I'd never even heard of venture capital before moving to Nashville. Yeah, but I worked there for a few years, learned a lot about business, started my first company there, and then I had a brief stint in tech, and then 2020 happened. And I think, as was the case for a lot of people, 2020 really made me reevaluate my priorities, part of which included thinking about where do I want to put my time and energy. And that was the genesis of the Courage Collective. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, I wasn't really seeing the kinds of conversations I wanted to have as it related to equity, inclusion, and the employee experience. So I started the Courage Collective, and we've been fortunate to work with Fortune 500s all the way down to 10-person startups and anything in between, with the real goal of cultivating belonging in workplaces. So that's what I've been up to.
I love that. Cultivating belonging in workplaces. Love that. Okay. So glad that you're in this industry now. So it's all about, the topic today is all about really understanding what DEI is and what it means for business. So let's start there. What is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what does it mean in the context of business?
Yeah, when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, to put it simply, the fact is that people experience organizational cultures in different ways. So when we're speaking about diversity, we're just thinking about the presence of difference and representation in the organization. Equity is creating level playing fields and equal access for folks. And inclusion really speaks to that sense of belonging. And so when we look at organizations today, different identities experience the workplace in different ways. And so the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is really focused on creating places of belonging where people can show up authentically, have a great experience at work, and do their best work. And so that's the idea, and that's why it's relevant for business.
I love that. Okay. And now, as the founder of the Courage Collective, how do you contribute to this DEI industry?
Yeah, I think after 2020, especially, the market got especially saturated. A lot of people jumped in to try to offer services, consulting, whether it's learning and development, et cetera. For us, we take a strategic, holistic, and human-centered approach to the work. And so our work is twofold. We focus on consulting, and then we also focus on learning and development. Consulting looks at how do we incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into the employee experience. And then our learning and development focuses on just cultivating awareness, skill building, thinking about things that can help move the conversation forward and really improve the culture.
Okay, got it. And now, how do you all help Black entrepreneurs in understanding and implementing DEI principles in their businesses?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways. When I think about Black entrepreneurs specifically, one of the projects we have going right now is we're working with some Black-owned media companies to think about how they can continue to elevate their brands and make those brands more relevant, deliver more value to their partners. And so that's a really interesting project we have going right now. But I think in general with Black entrepreneurs, really what we're talking about is how are you making sure that your culture is a place where anyone can experience a sense of belonging and feel like they're growing. And so when you look at DEI as it relates to the employee experience specifically, it's like every employee is having an experience at the company. And so why not be intentional about the experiences that we want to design for people? In my professional career, I was one of the few or one of the only in a lot of the spaces that I worked in. And so when I look at business today, and I'm thinking about Black entrepreneurs, I'm like, whoever's in your organization, how are you making sure that you're leveling the playing field and making sure that they have access to growth, to career advancement opportunities, to professional development opportunities, to do their best work? And so those are the things that we think about when we're working with entrepreneurs in general, but specifically Black entrepreneurs as well.
I love that. And I think you kind of touched on this, but I want to ask it anyway. How does all of this, because when we hear about diversity, Black people are like, okay, where do we fit? So how does a focus on DEI really benefit Black entrepreneurs specifically, and how Black entrepreneurs can overcome the barriers and create a more inclusive and equitable business environment?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say specifically to the Black entrepreneurs, and maybe I'll take this a little different direction, is we have to think about the way that the world is evolving. And specifically by that, the demographics in the world are shifting. And so if you're a Black entrepreneur and you're thinking about growing your business, the question that I would ask from a D&I lens is your product or service accessible to the most amount of people, right? So we think about shifting demographics of the world. How are you calibrating your product or service to make sure that it's relevant for someone with disabilities, for folks in the LGBTQ plus community, right? So thinking about including various identities and making sure that your product or service is relevant for those folks. That's more products externally facing as it relates to your consumer or your customer. But when we look at internally, how are you designing your culture to make sure that people are having a meaningful experience? And so is it accessible? Are you going through the right channels as far as your hiring processes, et cetera? Those are some practical things that I think about more inside the walls.
Love that. Okay. And I know we spoke about it a little just briefly before we hopped on the call, but really understanding why this conversation is important in terms of the application to businesses. So Black entrepreneurs having a solid understanding of DEI, like why do you think it's important for us to have these conversations?
Because I think we're directly impacted, right? I mean, being a Black person, someone from a historically marginalized or underrepresented group, one of the things that I think about specifically is as I've gone through the sales process, for example, when I'm pitching our business to various prospective clients, I'm usually interacting with people who don't look like me, right? Those are the people in the positions who are making the buying decisions often, not always, but often. And so when I think about that, I'm like, okay, well, what is my superpower? What is my magic? How can I leverage what I am uniquely qualified, gifted, skilled to do? And what is my lens that I can apply to this prospective client? And so for me, understanding DEI in part is just understanding who you are, what your skill set is, what your magic is, and then how can you make that relevant and applicable to your client, leveraging your unique identity. So I think part of it is understanding that and then being able to translate that into your product service or into, you know, whatever clients you're working with. So that's what I would say part of why it's important.
Okay. And also speaking, so we've talked about how it helps entrepreneurs, and I want to also talk about what it means and how it actually works in the context of business. So can you provide some examples of how DEI can be applied in the various aspects of business operations?
Sure. So we think about DE&I at the Courage Collective specifically through the lens of the employee experience. And by that, I mean, there are three different phases of the employee experience. The employee experience starts before someone starts at your company, while they're at your company, and then once they leave your company. So for example, if we're looking at the pre-employment phase, DEI can be embedded into the pre-employment phase by thinking about your hiring process, by thinking about the language and images that you're using on your website, by thinking about your kind of external brand and presence. And so is the language inclusive? Do you have unique representation? Who's represented in positions of leadership? Those are some things that we think about in the pre-employment phase. And then is your hiring process equitable? So that's a very practical way that we think about it in the first phase of the employee journey. When we look at while someone's at your company, I mean, that is pretty robust. And so that can be things like who has access to growth and promotion, and is that happening in a more ubiquitous sense across the organization? Or are there certain people who always get promotion and other people who get left behind? That's one thing to consider. We also think about learning and development. And so making sure, one of the requests we've had a lot lately is for people managers to think about managing an inclusive workforce. And so, you know, making sure that those people have the skills that they need and that they're trained. And so that's one of the practical applications in during employment. And then post-employment, you know, whenever someone leaves your company, oftentimes they'll really tell the truth about how it felt to work there, right? And so making sure that you have your exit interviews in place. Are you gathering the data that you need to learn from those experiences and then inform, you know, creating a better employee experience while they're there, and then even your recruiting strategy going forward? So there are a lot of practical ways. A lot of people only think about DE&I through the lens of recruiting and hiring or learning and development. But for us, it's like the aperture can be a lot broader. And so we have to consider how we're embedding it across all of our business functions.
Yes, certainly. And Dave, one of the things I love about the work that you're doing at the Courage Collective is, in all of this, talking about the importance of having a holistic and human-centered approach, putting people at the center. Now, can you explain like what that means to take a holistic and human-centric approach to DEI and why it's important?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, in 2020, probably when DEI was at its fever pitch, 2020 and 2021, a lot of companies took this really reactive and manic approach to DE&I. You know, every company was putting out a statement about how they value inclusion and all of that. And I think where it fell short was it wasn't meaningfully invested in advancing equity across the organization in a sustainable way. It was more reactive and like to meet the moment and to, you know, get good PR or whatever. But was it committed to sustainable change? And the way that we can ask or figure that out is when we look and fast forward, the question is, how are people actually experiencing the organization? There's some data that talks about, you know, tech companies that made these big statements actually have fewer Black employees, right? Things of that nature. And so when we look at taking a holistic and human-centered approach, holistic for us is embedded across the entirety of organization. And human-centered is really considering the employee experience. And so digging into who are you and how are you feeling at work, and then creating an environment where people can thrive. And so that's what it's about for me. I think sometimes we lose sight of the human experience and just try to make it about, the data or the processes, which both of those things are important, but we can't forget the fact that this really is about people at the end of the day. It's really about people and the people that are contributing to your mission, your vision, and your goals. And if we lose sight of that, it's hard to really create meaningful impact.
I agree. And I love that you mentioned the tracking aspect of it, the data. Now, my question to that is, how are people being held accountable? Like, how are organizations being held accountable? Who's tracking that? And then what happens?
Yeah, it depends on the organization, frankly. A couple of metrics that we focus on. So we always do an inclusion and belonging survey when we're working with organizations. And basically that allows us to set a baseline for the employee experience. What's going on with people? How are they feeling? Do they feel like they have the right access or growth opportunities, et cetera? And then we always want to track some of the representation data. So what does representation look like in the organization? One of the data points that we typically find is with Black and brown people specifically, they are overrepresented in the junior levels and highly underrepresented in the more senior levels of leadership. And so when we're looking at that and we establish a baseline of understanding, we have to say, okay, this is where you're at today. Now, how can we focus on increasing representation at all levels of the organization, and especially in positions of leadership? And then when we look at inclusion and belonging survey, the question we're asking is, how can we ensure that people's scores are going up? Like if they, if 80% of people reported that they feel a sense of belonging, how can we put some initiatives in place to move that to 85? And so things like employee resource groups, for example, are ways that we see organizations implement that. But yeah, I think it has to be intentional to see growth as it relates to some of your baseline metrics.
And what are the benefits of all of this as opposed to going about business as usual?
I think we're going to find out, right? Because a lot of companies have gone back to business as usual. And part of what I would say is because, they tried these reactive measures that were only about quantifying or making a pithy statement, but not really about impact, not really about creating inclusion and belonging. And so as a result of that, a lot of the efforts have waned. But I think the companies that have continued to prioritize equity and inclusion, one of the benefits is a higher retention across the employee base, for example. And then you have advocates in the organization who really champion the work that you're doing. I think the reality is that when you bring in people of different identities, backgrounds, perspectives, it can have a measurable benefit on what you're able to achieve as an organization. But I think it takes work to be able to do that and sustain that. And I think the reality is a lot of organizations were only interested in the symbol of change and not the reality of change. And as a result, they're kind of backing off some of the efforts. But what we've seen across our work is the companies that have truly continued the work, it's a competitive advantage, both as it relates to your product and service, but then also as it relates to your culture.
Gosh. And so entrepreneurs are listening and they're like, okay, is this a department that I have within my company that focuses on this? Or is it something that I outsource or just have it within the onboarding of the company? So how detailed does it have to be?
Yeah, I think the truth is that it's everyone's responsibility. So whoever is in the organization, you have responsibility for the culture and creating a culture of belonging. When it's viewed that way, it's a lot more sustainable. One of the things that we saw 2020 was a lot of companies hired chief DEI officers, didn't provide the resources that they needed. And a lot of those people you have either left the organization or, that they were let go because the results didn't really match the investment. And so I think part of the truth is if you're a Black entrepreneur and you're thinking about how to set this up in your business, first of all, know that it's everyone's responsibility. Number two, a lot of companies use what we would call a DE&I committee. And so they have a handful of employees across the organizations, varying levels, who are invested in the work. The thing that makes it successful, though, is number one, the buy-in, engagement, and investment. And then number two, the resources. So if you think about different functions of business, if you don't resource your marketing or you don't resource your business development strategy, you're not going to see results. DE&I is the same way. If you don't resource it, you don't put the people and the dollars behind it, you're not going to see results. And so that's the main thing that I would say, make it a priority, and then for everyone across the organization, and then make sure you have the resources to put behind it.
Well said. And now for you, like, how does the Courage Collective incorporate this human-centric and holistic approach to DEI? And can you share some examples?
Yeah, a few examples that come to mind. I really think about the power of human story. And so one of the things that we try to do in a lot of our conversations is just humanize the conversation, which by that, it's really connecting with the unique individual experiences that people have. And so we have done learning sessions in the past where we'll create space for people to share their unique individual stories. And as a part of that, think about like, okay, well, how does this translate to a feeling of belonging? And so I think the power of story is really salient as it relates to that question. I think another way that we do it is we did a inclusion and belonging survey recently with an organization. And when we looked at the data, different identities were having a wildly different experience in the organization. People who came from the LGBTQ plus community were not having as great a time as, some of the white males in the organization. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's look at that and let's think about why. And then let's put some immediate actions in place to make sure that we're creating a better experience for all employees. And so we want to look at the human experience and then think about how can we support people based upon what their experiences is and what they need.
Love that. And I want to talk about now the work that you're doing even more. So how can you help entrepreneurs who are listening, who are just starting out and may not have much knowledge about DEI? Like, what would it be like to work with you?
Yeah. So my work, first of all, I empathize with being an entrepreneur. It's tough, and so I can speak from that lens as just getting in the trenches with entrepreneurs and understanding what it means to grow a business. I think from a DE&I perspective, one of the main things to consider is like, how are you building your team? And then how are you positioning your products and services? And so for us, a couple of things, inclusive design is a part of the work that we do. So we're doing a project with a company right now who they have a health tech focused product and they're wanting to make sure that it's inclusive of different identities. And so one of the ways that we could support organizations is if you have a product or service that you're looking at, we can do what we would call an equity audit of sorts to make sure that it is accessible and equitable for different types of identities. Because again, as the demographics are shifting in the world, you have to make sure that your product is relevant for the most people. So that's number one. And then I think practically we do consulting services that are supporting, how are you designing your hiring process? How are you designing your employee experience and retention strategy? Things of that nature we can support entrepreneurs with as well.
And I always think about like the first, especially when people are listening, they're like, okay, I want to really set this proper foundation first. It may be just me right now. So what advice would you give to someone is like, okay, I want to make sure my foundation is set and it's proper. What are some things that I should do right now to set me up for a success in the future?
Yeah, great question. I would say start with your values. And so when you think about your personal values, I think oftentimes organizational values are a reflection of the person's values. So the question that I would ask to an entrepreneur is, what are your values and how are you making sure you're embedding those things into the organization? For us, we value courage, we value empathy, we value the human experience. And so I've made sure that I was clear about what my values are and how that informs the culture that I create within my team and even the people that are attracted to the work that I do. And I think the other piece of really defining your values is, for us at least, it's had a real self-selection element to it. So by that, I mean, when we're looking at new clients and prospects, if we're not aligned at a values level, we're probably not going to work with them. And so it's really allowed us to stay clear on who do we want to work with, what is the kind of work that we want to do, and what are we going to walk away from because it doesn't align with our values. And so I think that takes courage. And so what I would suggest for entrepreneurs is get clear on what you value. And then the second piece would be like, what is your unique value proposition? So what is the thing that you're uniquely qualified to do that you want to offer to the market, and making sure that you're doing that in a compelling way. So those two things, clear on your own values, and then get clear on your unique value proposition.
Good advice. And so it makes me think about, as entrepreneurs, sometimes we're stuck in our ways. So what do you do when what you're doing isn't working and you notice you're like, okay, I hear what Daniel's saying. I need to go make some changes, but it's going to be tough to let go and change some things within my organization. Like, how would you advise someone to start to make those slight changes?
The first thing is to ask why and get curious about why it isn't working. And so sometimes it could be the positioning is off. You haven't clearly defined your customer. You know, I think as entrepreneurs, sometimes we get really excited about the product or the service that we're offering, and we don't know who the heck it's supposed to be for. And the consumers will tell us if they value it by the way that they interact with it and spend their money. And so if we have something that is not working, first question is why. And then as we investigate the why, then I think we have to be willing to evolve. We're kind of in that place right now, transparently, like thinking about our own business and how the DE&I landscape has changed. We're asking ourselves, what is our unique value and what is the position that we want to have in the market? So if you're an entrepreneur and you have things that aren't working, first of all, you have to acknowledge that it's not working and then be willing to go through the process of evolution. Part of that means letting go of some things that aren't aligned with where you want to go, and then really being courageous and pressing into the exploration of what does this new thing look like. And so, yeah, I think it's the evaluation, the curiosity at a baseline. And then I think one of the best ways you can do that is just ask your customers, right? Like ask your clients, what about your product or service do they value? And then you can figure out, like, how can I continue to hit the mark? And then also the last thing I would add here is you have to be honest about what you really enjoy and your own why with the business in the first place. And so I think sometimes people start businesses and then they just get so far away from their original intent or what they really imagined at the beginning. And then they're running a business that they have no desire or passion for. And that's not sustainable. So kind of reset on why you're doing it and then figure out like why the thing you're doing isn't working.
Totally agree. And Daniel, so we have learned so much, and I want to ask you about, so someone is listening, what would you say are the benefits of maybe outsourcing this or seeking advice from a consultant versus trying to figure it out on your own?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has their unique lane and their unique magic. You know, for me personally, I'm in the process of moving, and one thing I'm not is a handyman, and I know that that's not my lane. And so if I have things that need to be assembled or fixed, I'm not going to spend my energy trying to do that because number one, it's going to be a pain. It's going to be frustrating. But number two, there's someone in the world who enjoys that a hell of a lot more than I probably do and understands it and knows it. And so I think the same thing is true with DE&I or any type of business expertise is like, what is your lane and what are you great at? And then really leveraging the skills, expertise, perspective of people who live this day in and day out, and specifically with huge organizations or small organizations. And so the benefit is just leveraging someone else's expertise and leveraging that to support your business growth and your business goals so that you can stay in your lane and do what you're great at.
Yes, stay in your lane. I agree. And one of the things you spoke about earlier is navigating kind of touching on some of those challenges as an entrepreneur. So for you yourself, what are some of those challenges that you've had to overcome in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is entrepreneurship is just tough. And it's one of these things in society that's glamorized. Like everyone should be an entrepreneur and you can make a lot of money. And then the reality is it's not always like that. So I'll give a couple of practical examples from my business. I have a service business, which means we deliver service to our clients and we make money when we deliver services. The benefit of having a services business is the fact that you can be cash flow positive very quickly. So we delivered our first learning series in 2020 and we were already making money, right? So that's great. But the downside is in order to make money, you have to deliver the services as opposed to like a product or an app or something where you can have some of this residual or recurring revenue. Services businesses don't work that way. So we'll have months where, you know, we're generating a few $100,000 in a month. And then we'll have months that are just slow. And so having to navigate the cash flow and managing that and making sure that the people on your team are still feeling invested in and they're making their money. Right. But it's like those things, like we've worked with some really big organizations who they take their time when they're paying the vendors. Right. And so it's like, so you're net 90 payment terms. I'm like, no, like we need this money yesterday. And so just try to manage the cash flow while also delivering value. And one of the things that I've found personally is like, you realize how little leverage you have when you're interacting with the Fortune 500 company. You've already delivered the service. You need the money, but they'll pay you when they pay you. And so I think that's one of the practical things that I've had to, learn to navigate. And then I just think that generally speaking, part of it is continuing to iterate on the product and service. For us, we do learning sessions, and I am someone who appreciates novelty, and I like kind of change and evolution. And so, just trying to keep the work and the product and the service fresh. I think that's a unique challenge that we've run into, especially when the environment around our work specifically is a little bit apathetic or ambivalent. So I think for entrepreneurs, part of the challenge is like, okay, how do I stay engaged with this? How do I continue to evolve, iterate, and deliver value and make sure that I'm staying engaged? Because if you're not engaged with the product or service, people will know, your customer will know, right? And so I think for me, it's just a part of it is making sure that I'm keeping it fresh. And I also like having a few different things going on at the same time. And so part of it is like, how do I make sure that I'm meeting my own needs while also continuing to grow this business? And so, I think that the self-awareness and understanding is a huge part of what makes entrepreneurs either successful or fail. And so those are some of the challenges that I continually consider.
And even during those challenging times, like how do you make sure that you still show up as a leader and lead?
Yeah, in my organization specifically, we've tried to align our values in a way that allows people to be who they are and be where they are. So for me, it started with the value of courage, vulnerability, authenticity, empathy. And I've just tried to live that and cultivate that with the folks on our team. And so, we were having a conversation yesterday with some of the people on my team, just thinking about, what is the work that really energizes us? And so part of it, leadership to me isn't necessarily always having the answers. It's just being able to be honest and authentic with where you are while also holding space for the people around you, and then being willing to make the decisions that are going to move your brand, product, or service forward and align to those values. And so, I think regardless of the challenges, for me, it's like I want to always be able to create space for myself, create space for others, and then press forward, when it gets tough, because I think that's just the nature of having a lead.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And Dane, we have a lot of first-time entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs listening. So what advice would you give to somebody in their first year of business?
Yeah, hang in there first and foremost.
Hang in there.
Stick with it, right? Yeah, stick with it. That's the first thing that I would say. But I think the second thing is like focus on creating value and solving problems, right? I think a lot of people think entrepreneurship is just, I have a great idea about a thing. What I would say is a good idea isn't a good idea unless it solves a problem. And you know that you're solving a problem for someone if they're willing to pay you for it, right? And so when I think about an entrepreneur, the thing I would say is like, what problem are you solving for your customer? How are you making their life better or eliminating a certain pain point? And how are you uniquely suited to do that? And so getting clear on the problem you're solving and your unique value proposition, that's the first thing. And then I think beyond that, it's like, no, like when you get told to no, because you will a lot, it's just part of the sales process. I think you have to learn from those experiences, adapt or adjust the way that you're positioning, really focus on the story arc, right? So what is the problem that you're solving and how are you uniquely suited to solve that problem for the organization, and then personalize it. And so you have to be persistent, have a level of perseverance, just keep going. And, I think one of the things with startups or first-time founders, part of the challenge is just staying alive, getting through your first year and delivering value to your first set of clients, and making sure you get your client testimonials or client stories. That's one of the things that grew our business the most is we had, our first set of customers, we delivered a high quality and value experience, and they became our biggest champions. I would say probably 80+% of our business has come through referrals. And so we delivered value for our clients. We went back and asked them, hey, can you tell us a little bit about how that impacted your organization? And then we were able to extract those testimonials and use those to leverage and get new clients. And so, I think sticking with it, but then also leveraging the customer stories as a vehicle to attract new prospective clients.
Yes, that is so true. I love that, delivering value. And it's really good, the customer testimonials, because that's the first thing I do is go look at reviews. What are the people saying? So,
right.
Yeah. And for you, do you have any favorite tools or resources that have helped you in your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is when I worked in venture, one of my colleagues, the co-founder of the organization, his name is Marcus Whitney, and he wrote this really great book called Create and Orchestrate. And basically what it looks at is the 8 core components of business and entrepreneurship and just maps them out in a really comprehensive but simple way. Marcus's story is interesting. Like he taught himself how to be a software engineer after being working in the restaurant business. Right. And now he's a venture capitalist who invests in Black-owned businesses. And so he just made the aspects of business really easy to understand. And so that's what I would say. I mean, if you just need kind of foundational knowledge and understanding as it relates to that, Create and Orchestrate is a great place to start. I also listen to, a lot of different podcasts and just stuff on business in general. And then I think, the best resource is just being able to interact with people who are in a similar vein. So the work that you do, you're highlighting people who have businesses as well. And so just really learning and gravitating to some of these resources has been helpful for me.
Love that. And so now for our not so serious business round, some fun questions. Okay. So what's the strangest food combination that you've ever tried and surprisingly enjoyed?
The strangest food combination. I have to be honest, I'm not a very adventurous eater because I'm not that adventurous when it comes to food. Okay, let me say this though. My parents are from Ghana, right? And so they have some Ghanaian dishes that people who are more Americanized would find interesting, let's say. So one of the dishes is fufu, and it's soup. Yeah, so soup with kind of the fufu, and that's something you eat with your hands. Yeah, I would probably. It's more like a dumpling texture, and anyway, so that's probably something that people would find interesting. And then another dish is jollof rice. There's a lot of controversy between Ghanaians and Nigerians as to which jollof rice is better. Spoiler, it's Ghanaian jollof. But yeah, that's probably what I would say.
Okay, that's a good one. All right. So what's the most bizarre or interesting item you have on your desk or workspace right now?
Bizarre or interesting item. Honestly, I just moved, and so
okay,
I don't have anything anywhere. I'm still trying to find everything.
All right. So if your business had a mascot, what animal or character would best represent it and why?
If our business had a mascot,
yes.
The first thing that I thought about was a lion. And the reason I say that, low-key, I went to Lion King. So I was thinking both like Simba and Nala, right? So you have the fierceness, but then also the compassion and tenderness. I think that would be the mascot for our business.
Okay. And finally, what does it mean to you to be Black in business?
To be Black in business, to me, it means to be one of one. Like, you are the only person with your unique collection of experiences. And so for me, it's about, what does that mean? Finding my magic and delivering what only I can deliver. That's what it means, being aware of my own experience and then creating space for the experiences of others. And so that's what I would say it means to me to be Black in business.
Beautiful. Daniel, this has been amazing, and people are going to want to know, how can they find you? How can they support you and follow you? So please do share.
Yeah, so you can find our website. It's thecouragecollective.co. And then we're also the same on IG, thecouragecollective.co. And then you can find our LinkedIn. So same thing. You can just search The Courage Collective and we should pop up. So those are the primary ways that you can find us.
Got it. And definitely going to mention all of those in the show notes as well as the book as well. Thank you so much for being on the Black to Business podcast. This has been amazing and so insightful, and just so thankful for the work that you are doing and bringing awareness. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
What another great episode. Thank you, Daniel, for coming on today's show and dropping some amazing gems. Hey friends, this is Jamore, Chief of Growth and Innovation at Black to Business and the founder of Jamore Johnson Consulting. I'll be providing today's recaps and all the episodes for this month as we continue to show appreciation to Black businessmen, creators, and leaders in the community. There were 2 points that I gained from today's episode. The first was to get familiar with your intentions for starting a business. It's easier to intertwine your values and your business plan when you know why you're doing what you're doing. The more prepared and honest you are during this stage will prevent a lot of headache in the future. Trust me. The last was that there's no diversity in working culture, no distance your organization can go, or destination your company can reach without DEI. It all starts with us. The more we invest in it, the higher the employee retention will be, the better the metrics, and the greater the impact will be for your brand or business. Daniel said that a lot of organizations were only interested in the symbol of change and not the reality of change. Remember, DEI isn't a toy or a trophy you twirl around for brownie points. So don't play with it, don't play with it, don't play with it. As always, thank you for listening to today's episode. And if you liked it as much as I did, make sure you write a review or share it with a friend. Maybe just do both. See you next week.